Now that's the formal speechifying, and I guess the program, Rick, is to take questions now for a while. And have we got a roving mic here? Okay. If you want to make your way to the mic, or this room's not that big. If you can make yourself heard, I can repeat the question from here. So,
Peter.
Mr. Manning.
Right.
The name is Pete Alexander. I'm a senior.
Okay.
And the reason I wrote this, when you're a senior here, around between 70 and 80, if you go to the store to buy eggs, you can forget and buy cream instead.
I see. Okay.
But anyway, here's the question. I would like to suggest that...
I'll repeat it here after. Yeah, or do you want to speak in the mic here?
I would like to suggest that the Reform Party in the next election promise the electorate, if elected, we would throw out the GST.
Okay.
That's when you missed the vote in Ontario last time. Okay, and since the Liberals promised to scrap the GST the last time, but didn't, it would give us a good chance to win in Ontario.
Okay.
And the vote should give us a break, and I think it will, in the largest populated area. End of speech.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
And I'm glad you came down to talk to us.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Peter says if you don't write it down your list when you go to the store, you might end up buying cream when you want to come home with eggs. So that's why he wrote his speech out. Well, certainly, I think reformers generally are receptive to the proposal that you've made. Our tax relief proposals are in two parts. The ones we're pressing this fall in the Parliament are this short-term package because it can be done immediately. The reductions in personal income taxes, the reductions in payroll taxes, and the reduction in capital gain tax. We do have a long-term proposal for eliminating the GST. And unlike the Liberals, we tell people exactly how it would be done. Our proposal has been to scrap the GST and to replace it with a flattened and simplified income tax system. Now, the reason we don't press that immediately is that is a very major change in the tax system. The transition requires a great deal of time. We put it as a long-term tax reform that's going to require a lot of consultation, not as a short-term one. Okay, you're getting a supplementary here, Peter.
But you know, it's the most hated tax in Ontario. We're cowboys here, but Ontario people hate that tax with a vengeance. And they told me, I happened to spend a couple of weeks in Ontario after the last election.
Yeah.
That's all they ever talked about. They said they missed the boat. Everybody voted heavy duty for a roof farm, but not quite heavy enough.
Yeah.
So
Okay, I hear what you're saying.
For goodness sakes, put it in there in big heading, capital letters.
And the thing I'd encourage you to do, if you have ideas on further tax reforms, including this one of Peter, what's going to be very important in this UA discussion is what is the tax relief plank that will be part of this bigger picture. And if you want to get involved with that committee that's working on that and argue for GST reduction or elimination rather than personal income tax, payroll tax, and capital gains tax, you've got the opportunity to do that. Okay, are there subsequent questions, either on this subject or on others? Yeah?
Where are you going to get your money? You've got to get rid of that big government.
Okay, good question.
You got to get rid of that.
Well, our answer to that is this. First of all, you could support a federal spending program of about $106 billion, which what our plan includes, which allows you to fund a lot of the things the federal government is doing, including about $2 billion more for Medicare. If you do that, the federal government will still run surpluses, a surplus of some $15 billion this year in the general revenue account alone, $26 billion in surplus in the employment insurance fund alone. Now, we say you finance this tax relief not out of cutting further cuts in spending, although we're open to eliminating waste, but you finance this tax cut through the surpluses. The difference between us and the Liberals is the Liberals want to spend the surplus on additional programs. We want to give the surplus, 50% of it, back to Canadians in the form of tax relief. And if you work through the numbers, and I'd encourage you to look at, particularly Monty Solberg is our finance critic. Monty's got a presentation, it'll be updated again for this fall, that shows how you can support $106 billion in spending and give this tax relief that I've talked about out of the surpluses and not by further cutting in services. I encourage you to look at that and see if it carries your judgment. The other place, when people say, where are you going to get money in the future, they either support reinvestment in things like health or education or tax relief. The other part of our program involves debt reduction. The federal government's carrying a $570 billion debt. It's paying $42 billion a year on interest charges alone. A $10 billion reduction in the federal debt frees up about $700 million a year that can either be reinvested in some program or, as we would prefer, given in further tax relief or debt reduction. So there's sort of two places for that revenue. One is the surpluses, the other is the interest savings on the debt reduction. These are very good questions because it's your money that's involved. And whatever's done with it ought to carry your judgment, not just the federal finance minister.
Who's next?
Don't tell me you got everybody happy here. Go ahead.
Isn't it true that the personal income tax is the most unfair and actually the GST equalizes?
Well, there's some people argue that consumption taxes hit everybody and that our personal income tax system has become very skewed. The burden is falling particularly heavy on the lower middle and middle income people because people of higher incomes have more opportunities to, yes, families, yes. Particularly in that the federal government collects about $11 billion from families and individuals that make $30,000 a year or less. It collects $6 billion from people that make $20,000 a year or less, who by the Liberals' own definition are below the poverty line. So that's one of the big arguments. I think this is behind your question for focusing a lot of that initial tax relief on the personal income tax and payroll taxes that really hit at that lower middle and middle income area. The other thing in our tax proposal that's relevant to the family question is also just to get fairness. As you know, our current system discriminates against the family that chooses to raise their children at home, that has a single income earner. A family that makes $60,000 and has 2 children, if it comes through 2 incomes and the children are in child care, will pay about $4,000 in income tax less than the single income family at the same level of income. So one of our other reforms gets to equalize that, which again reduces the burden on the family.
Not to mention homeschooling.
Yes.
We pay our taxes and we have to buy extra
Yeah.
for homeschooling.
Okay, here's someone going to use the mic.
Hi, Mr. Manning. That the Reform Party won't disappear, that have any meaning in any meaningful way in the future.
Well, there's 2 answers that I'd give to that. The first is the one I've already given. When did this occur? When did the Progressives and the Conservatives get together to form the... See, those of you, I think, know the history. The old Progressive Party was one of the most successful parties the West produced. It was an agriculture and transportation reform party. It got the Crow rate. It got the wheat pools established. It made an enormous contribution. It was mainly active in the 1920s. In the 1924 federal election, it actually got the 2nd largest number of seats, but declined to form the official opposition. Eventually, its policies were stolen by the Liberals, who stole all of its platform, and the Conservatives stole their leader and their name. That's where the Progressive Conservatives came from. And this gentleman's question is, what's to prevent that from happening? And my first answer to that was, when did all this happen? It happened in the 20s and 30s. It happened with the crippled West. It happened with a West that wasn't producing 30, 35% of the GNP, that was producing 20 or less. It would happen when the West had 60 seats in the federal parliament, not a third of the seats. And I guess my first answer to that question is, what would prevent that today is the West, and reform, because it's come out of the West, is a lot stronger relative to the whole than the Progressives were in their day. Now, so that's the one answer. The second answer is that reformers would do everything in our power to make sure that doesn't happen. We are committed to a set of principles. We won't go along with this idea if it violates those principles. Our members are going to have the final say as to whether we participate in this or not. So we have those two safeguards, the safeguards of the strength of the New West and the fact that ultimately our members have to go along with it and believe that it is in our best interests. Okay?